our guest this week, John Capouya, who is a recently retired Tampa University professor. But what we're interested in is his recent 2018 book, Florida Soul, From Ray Charles to KC and the Sunshine Band. You know John from talking to one of his journalism classes, and of course you're a big music fan yourself, Craig.
Yes. John he's got so many stories about this book, about the research that went into this book, about the interesting background of the people involved. You know, to me, it's kind of intriguing that he went into this book after having written a biography of Gorgeous George, the pro wrestler. So I really want to ask him, how do you go from pro wrestling to soul music, which pro wrestling is kind of, let's just say it's very fake. Soul music is all about authenticity and raw emotions. And I can't imagine how you get from one of those to the other.
John Capouya, here we go.
John, it's so great to have you on here today. Before we start talking about Florida Soul, I have to ask you about your previous book, which is a biography of Gorgeous George. You told me this great story about tracking down one of the sources for the book at a nudist resort.
So, Gorgeous George was a big celebrity in the 50s and into the 60s in entertainment wrestling, all showman.
Yeah.
He created this guy you love to hate image, a sort of quasi-effeminate, arrogant persona, and he became a big star. Inspired Muhammad Ali to say things like, I'm the prettiest and I'm the greatest, which Ali always admitted or complimented him on. He was deceased when I was writing this biography, so I was speaking to his contemporaries, people who wrestled with him or worked with him, as they call it, because it's sort of a, entertainment tag team. And I found this guy in San Diego who had worked with him a lot, named Don Arnold. He was a good guy, lifeguard, clean cut type wrestler, and George was obviously a bad boy, and they matched them up. He did tell me that later in his career, George, who drank himself to death, that George was drunk in the ring, and it made it really tough to work with him. But when I contacted him, he said, well, yeah, we're outside of San Diego a little bit, and my wife will tell you how to get here. So he put her on the phone. I was in New York. And she said, well, we're in this park, this community. And so you drive here, you drive there, or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And so I said, okay, great. And then she said, well, so when you come, will you be wearing clothes? And I said, yeah, I wear them all the time, and she said, well, we're nudists, essentially. And she said, we don't like living in the textile world. So she said, we are in a nudist colony, which turned out to be a trailer park. And so we're kind of expecting, that if you come to see us, that you'll conform to our ways. So I said, okay. Yeah. So I rented a trailer. I spent a few days out there. And believe me, it was not a sexy thing. At one point, though, we were in the trailer, we're in the kitchen, around the kitchen table, and Don is describing some of his signature moves, and he tells me about the figure 4 leg lock. And I'm like, I don't really, and he goes, well, here, right now. So the next thing I know, I'm lying down naked on this linoleum, this 250-pound naked guy on top of me. And I think, is this how all the great biographers do it? But I tell my students that story, and I say, the moral of the story is, say yes, don't say no. You never know, that's part of the fun thing about journalism. And to the extent that you can, make the people feel comfortable and show them that you're willing to.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that's what Craig was referring to.
Yes. So how do you go from writing about Gorgeous George and pro wrestling to writing about Florida soul artists like Ray Charles and...
Well, the same way my previous book before Gorgeous George was about yoga. I just followed my passions and my intrigue. In other words, I got into yoga. I realized that very few men were doing it. I thought it was great. So I wrote a book called Real Men Do Yoga. Learned a lot more about yoga by doing the book. I was not interested in pro wrestling at all. Never watched it. Thought it was stupid. I remember my grandparents watching it though. When we would go visit them, they would have it on the black and white TV, and my father would go, "That's fake. Come on," and he was a boxer, and I remember his parents go, "No, Mike, look at the blood. Look at the," like so. Anyway. I saw this documentary about Muhammad Ali, and he said, yeah, there was this white guy. I met him in Las Vegas when I was 19. I was Cassius Clay, and I saw him say things like, "I'm the prettiest and I'm the greatest," and the crowd went nuts. And he told me afterwards, we worked at the same place, "Hey, you could do this. You got a mouth on you. Besides, you're black. People are ready to hate you." So I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And then I was reading James Brown's memoir, I Feel Good. In it, he says, "So I saw the wrestler Gorgeous George on TV and his flamboyant act, and I started wearing robes and capes on stage, just like he did. And he had George was attended to in the ring by a butler character, a valet, named Jeffrey Jeffries." And James Brown's version was he had the Cape Man, a guy who would run out, but James Brown would pretend to collapse on stage, and this guy would run out and put the cape on him. So I'm like, wow, how about that? And then the weirdest one of all is I'm reading Bob Dylan's memoir. And obviously he didn't take any showmanship from Gorgeous George.
No.
But it turns out when he was little Bobby Zimmerman in Minnesota, trying to be a musician. Nobody wanted to listen to his band. Let's face it, his voice, he's got a terrible voice, right? I mean, and he was about to give it up. And he said, "I could either go work in the iron mines, which is what you do in northern Minnesota, or I was thinking about going to West Point," which I, couldn't believe. And then he says, "But I was performing in this armory one day, and in comes Gorgeous George, the wrestler." And he says that he was unbelievably charismatic and that he thought he and George exchanged a look, and that George was giving him some kind of vibe such that he said, "It inspired me for years to come. I didn't give up being a performer. And I never forgot his charisma," and blah, blah, blah. So I'm like, wait a minute, Muhammad Ali, James Brown, Bob Dylan, these are like three of the greatest performers of my lifetime. And they all said they were influenced or inspired by this guy who's like, doesn't even wrestle. Who is this guy? So that was the genesis. And then the same thing happened with Florida Soul. It began to, when I moved down to Florida from New York, I had, I similarly had a series of revelations or things were introduced to me such that I didn't even know Ray Charles was from Florida. He sang Georgia on My Mind pretty good.
You assumed he was from Georgia, yeah.
And he was born in Georgia, but when he was 6 months old, his mother took him to North Florida, where he grew up in a little town called Greenville. And he went blind there. He went to the St. Augustine School for the Deaf and Blind, and he learned to read music in Braille there, which was very important.
Yeah.
He became a professional in Florida. He wrote his first songs in Florida. He recorded his first songs in Florida, including the St. Pete, Florida Blues. And he had his first success in Florida. So, yeah. Okay.
Well, and he did turn our state song into a rock and roll number, right? Swanee River Rock.
Way down up on the Swanee, talking about the river, yeah, so far away, oh yeah, that's where my heart is a turning. Oh.
So that was sort of the equivalent of me finding out that Muhammad Ali was inspired by Gorgeous George. So then I read that Sam Moore, Sam and Dave was one of the bands that I grew up with, and they did Soul Man and Hold On, I'm Coming, I Thank You. When I was growing up, I grew up on their music and I loved it. I knew they recorded for Stax Records in Memphis, these big hits. But it turns out Sam Moore is from Overtown, black neighborhood in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
That's where he met Dave Prater, who's from Georgia, not from Florida. They formed their duo there in a nightclub called the King of Hearts in Liberty City. And they had their first success there. They did their first recordings there, so much so that they were invited to come and record at Stax Records, et cetera. So I'm like, oh, how about that? So, and then I encountered this urban legend about Tampa, which is that the big hit, probably the biggest song and dance craze of a boomer era is the twist. You know, and if you were alive at that time and you realize like it was, everybody was doing it, young people, older people, black people, white people, they were twisting in the Soviet Union. Jackie and John Kennedy were twisting in the White House. It was on the cover of Life magazine. I mean, it was huge. The huge song was recorded by Chubby Checker,
right?
And in Philadelphia. Dave Clarke had him do that, and then Dave Clarke had him on his very popular TV show, American Bandstand, and the thing took off. The rest is history, or as I say in the book, twistery. Come to find out, at least in Tampa, they believe that, well, we know that Hank Ballard wrote that song, and Chubby Checker covered it at Dick Clarke. I'm sorry, did I call him Dave Clarke? That's the Dave Clarke 5, that's somebody else.
Yeah, Dick Clarke. Yeah,
Dick Clarke, at his behest, and basically he created Chubby Checker, this guy's name, I forget what it was, and he had him do it, you know, note for note, word for word cover, and then he had the guy on his TV show, and it blew up. Hank Ballard had previously released it a year or two before, and had a hit on the R&B charts. You know, at the time, the record business and sales were segregated like everything else. There was the R&B charts, in which was the music that was selling to black people by black performers, and then the Hot 100 or the pop chart. Hank Ballard's song only ever penetrated the R&B chart. The good news is he did get the songwriting credit. So,
he made some money off of it. Yeah.
All of the success that Chubby Checker had, at least, you know, he did get paid. And so the story was, and on the 50th anniversary of the twist hitting #1, I wrote a story for the Tampa Bay Times about this idea. And it seems, in fact, that Hank Ballard said he and the Midnighters, his band, were playing Tampa, one of those clubs on Central Avenue, which it was the center of the Black Arts and Entertainment District, the business district in Florida, in Tampa, when it was segregated. And he saw these young, like teenage girls doing this crazy little dance, swiveling their hips on Central Avenue. And he asked them what they were doing. And they said, it's a little thing we made up and we call it the twist. So he wrote a song, put some lyrics to it, and he recorded it in Cincinnati. And so I did in some investigation, and it seems very much that it's true. The twist came from Tampa. Now, again, this is starting to build up. Like we've got Ray Charles, Sam and Dave, the twist, you know. So now I'm looking, you know, those things just came to me. So then I find out that James and Bobby Purify, the other probably most successful and best known soul duo, were from Florida, Pensacola.
My hometown.
Okay, so what was their big hit? You remember?
I'm Your Puppet.
Yeah, I'm Your Puppet. Very, very different sound, very pop, you know. So I interviewed both of them, James and Bobby. James just died. And I interviewed their producer, Papa Don Schroeder.
Oh, yeah.
who put them together. And actually, Bobby Purify wasn't related, and he wasn't even named Bobby Purify, but it was the producers. It was a publicity thing, and he thought it would be good. So he said, "You're Bobby Purify," and the guy said, "Okay." You know? So they had a lot of success. You know, these things just started to build, and I realized in Miami there was a guy, a producer, who produced a lot of music that I grew up listening to. A guy named Henry Stone, who's since deceased, had TK Records, and he had Betty Wright on his label, who had a
Cleanup Woman.
Cleanup Woman. I think she was 17, 18 years old with that. A guy named Latimore, who lives in Riverview, had a song called Let's Straighten It Out. That was a big hit. You still hear it on Quiet Storm radio or whatever. And then I found out there's a woman named Linda Lyndell who grew up outside of Gainesville singing in the black church, but she's white. And she had a song that went, what a man, what a man.
What a mighty good man.
What a mighty good man.
Yes.
And that was a big hit, and nobody knew she was white. And she performed on the otherwise all black Chitlin circuit with a black band. So I interviewed her, and I interviewed the guy who led the review that she was part of. At this point, I think probably before this sequence was completed, I proposed it to the University Press of Florida. They seemed like the natural publisher, and they went for it, and they issued a contract. It was a labor of love. I spent a long time tracking these people down and driving all over Florida to sit down with them, all the people who were still alive.
Right.
I kind of avoided people who weren't because
they don't talk much.
Their interviews tend to be less engaging. But obviously, Ray Charles, there's a lot out there on him. The only person I could not get to who I wanted to very badly and who's alive is Betty Wright. I just could not penetrate her PR apparatus. And I had, Timmy Thomas is another guy who was on that same TK Records and performed and recorded with Betty Wright. And he's like, I'll call Betty. Don't worry, I'll hook it up. Like, didn't happen. I spoke to Betty Wright's sister and I didn't get to talk to her. So, and then she recently passed also.
She died recently. Yeah, it was a shame.
Super talented. And she was a vocal coach and a minister. And, I really wanted to talk to her. But, So, and it was actually a great way of me kind of getting to know Florida more and better, because I didn't go to the tourist places. I went to where like X person lived, and the other fun part about it is my wife, who's a photographer, although not really a journalist photographer, but she came along and she took contemporary portraits of the people who survived. So those are in the book. So, it was very satisfying. There was no financial payoff with that. That's books. At least it turns out, I think that even a lot of people from Florida did not realize that they are, in fact, a soul capital of this country.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think people don't think of these groups and think, oh, that's Florida. That's Florida producing all these soul groups. They assign it to Memphis or Atlanta or, New York, someplace like that.
Motown. Well, I think Motown is kind of a clue. Also, New Orleans is great R&B town.
Oh yeah.
I think a lot of those places that we mentioned, they've got like a distinctive sound. Certainly Motown did. Mm-hmm. In Memphis, there was a Stax sound, and then later a High Records sound, Al Green's label.
Oh yeah.
New Orleans sounds, New Orleans-y with the funky meter that they use. And Florida, being so big and so diverse, I don't think, there is no Florida soul sound. And I think maybe that's one reason. Like the I'm Your Puppet that you mentioned, Craig, that sounds nothing like I'm a soul man,
Sure.
In Miami, some of the soul music has some Latin
influence
flavor.
Too. Mm-hmm.
Also some Caribbean influence down there. In fact, I interviewed Harry Wayne Casey, is
AKA
KC of the Sunshine Band.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that originally the name of the band was KC and the Sunshine Junkanoo Band. Junkanoo is a Bahamian festival, and there's a big Bahamian population in Miami. When they have this festival and parades, there's a music that they play, which involves a lot of horns, a lot of whistles, a lot of percussion. And initially, they were trying to recreate that sound and become sort of an ersatz Junkanoo band. So I think the disparity, or you could look at it as the wealth of different sounds, is a great thing for us as listeners. And it adds up to a great cultural heritage. But I think it's too dispersed for people to say, That's Florida soul.
Yeah. That's interesting. You mentioned that because that was going to be my question. Was there some sort of network or infrastructure that allowed these people to rise to the top? And it doesn't really seem that way. You got Pensacola, Tampa, Miami. Those are hundreds of miles apart. So there seems more like brilliantly talented individuals overcoming all of the odds to somehow make it, despite there not being any real groundwork in Florida to prop them up upon.
Well, the exception is this, like a lot of things in Florida, the locus is Miami, and this guy, Henry Stone, was behind a lot of the music. KC recorded for him. KC was a clerk in his record thing. Like he put records in packages when people ordered them for Henry. And then he said, well, can I use the studio after hours and try to fool around? And he's like, yeah, go ahead. That was kind of the most influential, but other than that, yeah, but it has no connection to people all over this,
Yeah. So, well, who recorded for Henry Stone? Was Betty Wright another one who recorded for him?
Yes.
Yeah.
Betty Wright, KC, Latimore, Timmy Thomas. A lot of the people that are in my book, they either came from there or they gravitated there because he was a distributor for Atlantic, so he had a connection. In fact, he was part of the way that Sam and Dave got to Stax, because they were an Atlantic artist and they recorded at Stax for them. So, Henry Stone was a very influential guy. Like a lot of producers, some of the artists feel that he took advantage of them. That's kind of a perennial in the music business. I don't know, obviously I don't know the truth or not of that.
Yeah, you're a writer, not an accountant.
and some other people swear by him. And I must say, he was great with me. So the book is sort of constructed, it goes chronologically, beginning with Ray Charles in the mid 1940s. And then it ends with KC and the Sunshine Band in the late 70s. So I sort of align that each different person or group is a chapter, like each singer, each musician.
Another reminder that this week's episode of Welcome to Florida is brought to you by Visit Sarasota and Visit Sarasota County. Hey, congratulations go out to Siesta Key, which has just been ranked #1 by the readers of TravelAwaits.com as the best beach in the United States. Reading from the website, our readers voted Siesta Key as the best beach in the U.S. in Travel Awaits 2021 Best of Travel Awards. Our writers love it too. That's probably because in addition to powdery white sand beaches made of quartz, this Gulfside barrier island offers everything from kayaking and boating to fine dining and day drinking. Spend the day shelling, then savor succulent crab as you watch the stellar sunset. Siesta Key ranked #1 best beach in the U.S. by Travel Awaits online. No argument here.
Was it hard for you to find Linda Lyndell? Because I know she kind of went into hiding after her big hit.
Yes, it was. I found a friend who vouched for me, a guy who performed with her and who was actually very helpful, a guy named Charles Stedham, who goes by Charlie Blade, and he is from Gainesville. And he worked with Linda in this, on the circuit. Yeah, she, as she told me, and then I describe in my book, she just had her biggest success at Stax recording What a Man. And it was produced by a guy named Dave Crawford from Jacksonville, who did a lot of work at Atlantic. He also was a producer for Jackie Moore, who did a song called Precious, Precious. She's from Jacksonville. Right after that song came out, she was supposed to go back to Stax and record more. And the way she told me is then Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. Racial things got very fraught and very heated. And she was told they didn't need any white people around at Stax. Thank you very much.
Well, did she not get some threats from the Klan too for being a white singer?
Yes, she was. Also, when they were on the road, they traveled throughout the South on this chitlin circuit, and law enforcement and other officialdom did not like to see this white lady traveling with all these black guys. The way Charlie Blade told me, they said, well, look, a black band they could understand, a white band they could understand. a white lady with a black band, And so at one point she told me she bought an Afro wig.
Oh my God.
And put it on. So she would wear it in the car, in the station wagon, or whatever. So people would just look and go, or a bunch of black guys, or, people kind of got it from both sides. There was the clannish side that, like, we don't like you hanging around with these black guys. And then after Dr. King was killed, we don't necessarily want to be around too many white people right now either. So she basically had, retired,
Wow. Became this one-hit wonder, but then it resurfaced because it got re-recorded, right?
Yes. It was a combination of En Vogue and Salt and Pepper, I think.
Yes.
They all collaborated on What a Man, What a Man, What a Mighty Good Man. One thing about that song also that's kind of typical of soul music and a fair amount of Florida soul music is Dave Crawford, who supposedly wrote it, although Linda says she wrote it, co-wrote it with him. A lot of it was apparently improvised, and it's not much to the lyrics, really, beside that chorus, which is great.
Yeah.
It was originally, that song is about Jesus. It was a church song that Dave Crawford transposed into a secular song. And for example, that happened a lot. Like Ray Charles' song, I Got a Woman Way Across Town, that was I Got a Savior, right? So when this started happening, a lot of church folks were not happy with Ray Charles and other soul musicians because they were taking the sacred and making it the profane. You know? In Ray Charles' case, they had to get over it because he was a genius. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of times the Chitlin Circuit. Explain what that is.
It's a name that was used to describe, again, during the time of segregation. There was always, there was a black part of town in which the black business and entertainment district was, and black people lived. And there were clubs there. And so black performers would go from one black part of one town to another throughout the South. And in Florida, you would say, let's say, go Pensacola, Jacksonville, Orlando, Tampa, St. Pete. I don't know, whatever is between there and Miami. And then this guy, Lavelle Kama, with whom Linda Lyndell won, they went all into Texas and whatever. So it was the black entertainment venues where black performers perform for black customers, except for Linda Lyndell. And so the Chitlin references because that's soul food. I also found out, when I was doing this research, like the Chitlin circuit usually is thought of as kind of funky dives. And certainly out in the country, there's these juke joints. And I know performers told me like, well, you'd be out there and like, there'd be a lot of fights, and also like you could see through the floorboards, the dirt, because for one thing, there's a lot of agricultural workers in Florida then and now, and they would go to these places. But I learned this from Professor Gary Mormino, who's a great Florida historian, that after World War II, Florida was the most urbanized state in the South. And so in addition to these funkier juke joints, there were pretty elegant black clubs in the big cities where people would dress up and go there, and they would pay more to hear like a big band that would travel in, like, Cab Calloway or what have you. And I saw some pictures some of which I use in my book. And this one place with a huge balcony around it. And there's another one from an article in Crisis, which is the magazine of the NAACP. And they said, they called this place, I believe in Jacksonville, the finest dance palace owned by a Negro in the whole country. The dance floor holds 2,000 people.
Wow.
It may have been an exaggeration, but so partly why also people thrived in Florida and is that there were these two circuits in a sense. There was what we usually think of as the funky Chitlin circuit, and then the more elegant, upscale.
More sophisticated, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you listen to the music while you were writing? Did that help you along while you were writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I some of it I hadn't listened to in some time. To me, it holds up. I suppose every generation thinks that their music was, classic. But I say in my introduction to the book, I was watching ESPN one night and waiting for Monday Night Football to come on, and they cut away to a commercial and they played Sam and Dave, Hold On, I'm Coming. And I thought, you know what? That song is 50 years old. You cannot go to a wedding or a bar mitzvah without hearing a KC and the Sunshine Band song or three. And I listen also to Betty Wright, the cleanup woman. I'm like, you know what? To me, maybe that's the best Florida soul song of all. And Ray Charles is like, the guy's a genius. He did perform also with a country western band in Florida.
Yes.
The only black guy, and certainly the only blind black guy in that band. I think they were called the Playboys. And he later went on to record 2 albums of country songs, and they were fantastic. So especially before I was about to go interview someone, I would listen to their music, like the Purifies or what have you. And yeah, it really brought it all back to me.
Was there any of it that you were hearing for the first time you'd never heard before, and you went, wow, how did that not penetrate my consciousness before now?
I mean, I'm sure there were, because like I said, when I came down here, I didn't know any of these people from Florida. In my defense, I would say, when you're listening to the AM radio in your car, as we used to do, and they play The Cleanup Woman by Betty Wright, they don't say, she's from Miami.
Well, maybe they should. I didn't know the Cornelius brothers and Sister Rose were from Florida, for instance. That was that was brand new to me.
Yes, yeah. And there some people told me, you should have written about them, you should have included them. And Greg, you probably get this kind of thing when you have your book.
Oh yeah.
It comes up with what you did wrong. And I just try to be nice and go, look, you can't put everything in a book. When would you stop? Or,
yeah.
Or you know what? I didn't know that. I'm sorry. So when you write your book, you'll do it better.
That's right.
You talk about finding a stopping point for the book, and you chose that with the 70s and Casey and the Sunshine Band. Yeah. What did this movement evolve into? If I had to guess, maybe the Miami hip hop scene with 2 Live Crew and the bass scene, that type of deal in the 80s.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think there maybe it was the disco era in between, and some people consider KC and the Sunshine Band disco, although he rejects that. And then actually the 2 Live Crew and some people's people, they were recorded by Henry Stone too. Wow. So he had his hand in a lot of things. But yeah, that was the bass and that kind of stuff coming out of Miami. Disco really did a lot of harm to the soul business and soul performers. Some of them tried to go disco, with greater or lesser success. Johnny Taylor had a successful song called Disco Lady, but, not his best work. And then I think, it moved into hip hop. Yeah. For all I know, there's a Florida hip hop book to be written, but it's not going to.
There you go. with Pitbull and all the rest.
Yeah. Some people have suggested Florida jazz, like the Cannonball Adderley and his brother, Nat Adderley, this person, that person. And I'm like,
When did you move to Florida?
2009, I think.
What were your perceptions of the state before living here?
I didn't have too many perceptions. I had only been to Miami, I never went to Disney World or whatever. And I visited the University of Tampa a couple of times, which is where I ended up being a professor. I guess I read about the Everglades. So, it was a pretty ill thought out move. To be honest, and you can ask my wife if you don't believe me. Yeah. But I had, I think, very little sense of it. I really wanted to get a professor's job so I could have time to write. And ultimately, you get tenure and you have some security, which I did. So I actually, I just retired from there. It worked out pretty good. If I hadn't come here, I would have thought of something else. But I also got involved in a project. My wife came down and she started a project in which she photographed the ruins or the remains of Native American mounds and earthworks and things like that remain, and many are still here.
Yes.
And she had photographed some of them before in other southern states. And so we did a project together. And again, we drove around the state to all these places. So she took black and white landscape pictures. And, they're not what they were. So, it's very They're very
Yeah.
kind of evocative. And I researched the people who made them and what they were about, and what, we did an art installation that we collaborated on, in which she printed out her pictures like really big on fabric, like 6 foot by 6 foot pieces of fabric that hung in the museum. And then I wrote little vignettes about each of these pictures, and we projected them on the walls of it was in the Appleton Museum in Ocala.
Mhm.
And we showed it at the Moran Art Institute in St. Petersburg. So that was to say that we got something else out of being in Florida too,
Yeah.
that we would not have gotten elsewhere.
John Capouya, Florida Soul, from Ray Charles to Casey and the Sunshine Band. There's a link down in the show notes to purchase the book. Thank you so much for your time today.
This has been great. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Okay, thanks, guys.
What a guest. What a guest. What a mighty good guest.
You're a huge music guy, Craig. You're always sharing your favorite artists and songs on your social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Craig Times. Where does soul and the artists we've been talking about land in your greatest hits playlist?
Oh, well, I love it. And every Friday I post a Funky Friday clip. But I really love having that connection with James and Bobby Purify, and with Papa Don Schroeder, who was a DJ in Pensacola when I was growing up. I didn't realize he'd been a record producer. And then they didn't just do I'm Your Puppet. They also did a version of Shake a Tail Feather, which is a lot of fun as well. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I actually kind of like that better.
I had no idea the astonishingly famous What a Man, What a Man, What a Man was a cover. I am familiar with the contemporary version of that you hear everywhere still. To this day, I had no idea there was a Florida connection to that, and that's why we do the podcast in large measure to raise.
Hey, we're trying to inform people.